Hey everyone, I'm Almar of almarsguides.com, and in this video here, I'm going to be talking about my Enchanter class guide, which is the guide you see on screen right here, and I'm basically going to be giving you an audio version of this guide. I'm not going to be reading the guide word for word. I'm basically going to be going through the guide and just relaying my thoughts, more or less the same thing I did when I wrote the guide itself. This video is meant to serve as an audio version. It's mostly here for people who prefer videos, podcasts, and basically taking in information differently than through a written guide. I know that there's people out there who aren't like me, who prefer listening rather than reading, so I'm trying to basically cover all of my bases. So this guide starts in Classic EQ, and it goes all the way until the end of Prophecy of Ro, which is what I would consider the end of the original Classic era of EQ. Things start to change dramatically beyond Prophecy of Ro, and basically just all the classes change. The game kind of changes fundamentally as a whole, and then it kind of just stays consistent beyond that. So the one thing that doesn't change, though, throughout this entire time is Enchanters are always the best crowd control class in the entire game. They have multiple mezzes. Usually they have a short duration mezz that can't be resisted, a normal mezz which has a level cap. I'm pretty sure the short duration mezzes have a level cap too. And then they usually have like a mezz that goes over the level cap, and then they usually have an AoE mezz. All this is subject to change depending on which expansion and era you are in, though. I'm talking about mostly, I would say, Planes of Power, Omens of War is when they start, is when your spell lines get fleshed out enough to where you always get upgrades every 5 levels, is usually how it works. As an enchanter, you're also going to get things like mana regen, aka your clarity/key lineup, and you're also going to get haste, which is very important if you have any melee in your group. They're going to be begging you for that a lot, just as much as the casters are going to bug you for key. During this era of the game, or I should say during the early part of this era, you're also going to be able to use charm spells on your enchanter. During Planes of Power, you're going to get another charm, during Lucklin, actually. You're going to get a charm called Dire Charm, which will give you a permanent version of your charm spell that works on mobs that are level 46 and below. I'm pretty sure it starts at 46. And I don't think it goes above 46, if I'm not mistaken, although I could be wrong. And so Charm is extremely powerful from Classic until, I would say, Lucklin is when it starts to get a little bit worse, and then Planes of Power, or actually I guess you could say it stays consistent in Lucklin and POP, and that's when it starts to get worse because they start to change how Charm works after that. So Charm is a little bit of a high risk, high reward strategy that a lot of you guys may or may not like depending on your playstyle. I personally don't really like gambling, and Charm is kind of gambling because there's a random amount of time that your Charm may or may not last. So I personally don't like using Charm even when I play my Enchanters, but to each their own, and I feel that it's necessary to point out how useful it is during this era. So moving on to important stats and foci. So on an Enchanter, you're going to want to focus on Intelligence, Charisma primarily, and then with Stamina and Agility as your 2 secondary stats is what I would say. Now, you're going to get the most benefit for increasing your stats all the way until, I would say, end of Velius, beginning of Lucklin. That's when you more or less start maxing out all of your stats, depending on what type of gear you have for your character. If you're still in full group gear, you're probably not going to max out your stats. However, if you're like half group gear, half raid gear, yeah, your stats are probably going to start getting maxed, especially if you get Lucklin raid gear. That has a lot of stats on it. Of course, you're also going to want things like mana regen, which is also called flowing thought on gear sometimes. And you're also going to want to get some armor class and HP too, especially if you're an enchanter that uses charm. Enchanters that use charm will want more survivability than enchanters who don't, because you need to be able to take some hits when you use charm. Otherwise, you're just, your charm's going to break and you're going to go down. So as you can see here, I have a little bit of explanation of what each of these stats do. Charisma helps charm and mezz spells, and the rest basically, they're kind of self-explanatory. They do what you would expect them to do. So once Planes of Power is released, heroic stats will be added into the game, and this becomes more and more common as each expansion goes on. So heroic stats work kind of similar to normal stats. However, I would honestly recommend spreading them out a little bit more than you would normal stats. Also, once we get to the era where heroic stats come out, I would recommend you do a bit of research on them. You can see this guide that I have on my site right now, which talks about all of the heroic stats. and I also give you other explanations of this as well. So say you'd like to learn from Alakazam what heroic stats do, or from Fanra, or even the official Roshan post on the forums back in the day. All of this is great ways for you to learn more about heroic stats, what they do, and why you need them, more or less. It's eventually, after this era is when I would say heroic stats really take over, because that's when they start throwing a bunch of heroic stats at you, and more or less all benefit you get for your characters will come from those heroic stats. I mean, you also get AAs and other things too, but as far as stats go, eventually normal stats are faded out and heroic stats are kind of, what you'll be looking for on gear once that time comes. And that is towards the end of this era, but definitely in Prophecy of Ro it'll be like that. And maybe Dragons of Norath too. I'm not too sure about Omens of War. I've never really raided in that expansion before. Hopefully the servers I'm playing on now will change that, but we'll see. So moving on to, let's go back to the 3 important heroic stats for you as an enchanter. So you're going to want primarily heroic stamina and heroic intelligence. In my opinion, those 2 are the 2 most important. You're also going to want heroic agility. So how it's going to work is heroic intelligence is going to be your main caster sort of important stat, and that's going to increase your mana regen cap, and basically all the things you need as a intelligence caster. Heroic stamina and heroic agility are both going to increase your survivability, and both of them are quite important too. On live, most enchanters usually focus on heroic agility because you get enough heroic intelligence on your gear that you don't even really need to focus on it. So they just dump everything into heroic agility and heroic stamina instead, as far as AUGs go, I should say. So gear in the future, I'm talking about way distant future here, but for you guys at least, heroic intelligence will mostly all come on your gear, and then you can just get heroic stamina and heroic agility AUGs to flesh out the rest of the heroic stats that you need. So important foci. So mana preservation is going to be one of your most important ones. Extended range, this is also going to be important for you. Spell haste, of course. Improved damage, this depends on you and if you want to deal damage on your enchanter, which I would recommend you get that because it's going to help out. You don't really need the improved dot one because you have 2 or 3 dots and they're not that great. So extended enhancement, this increases the duration of your buffs. That one's quite important for you. About as important as all of these other ones. And then this one here, increased detrimental spell duration. So this is an interesting one, and this is an AUG that kind of fades away in future Everquest. So this will increase the duration of things like slow, cripple, and I believe even your mezzes. So that one would be important during, this era. But like I said, it eventually gets faded out, and they kind of just stop introducing it in the game anymore. At least to the best of my knowledge, I do not remember seeing that on live on current gear. And when I looked at the foci page, I don't remember seeing it either for anything that goes over level 75, I think it was. Also, the last 3 are improved dodge, improved parry/block, and reagent conservation. So improved dodge and improved parry/block are going to increase your survivability, and reagent conservation, this is going to reduce the reagent cost of some spells. So there's a slight chance that your spells will not consume reagents, basically. And enchanters actually do have a few spells you'd want to use that for. All of your rune spells will consume a gem of some kind, and that can get expensive fast, especially if you use them. I know many enchanters that do not use those spells solely because of the reagent cost of them. And that's a shame because those spells are actually quite good too. So important spells, skills, and AAs. Now we're moving on to the fun section. So, of course, we talked about before, you get mez spells, and also I bring up here illusion spells, enchant metals, memory blur, charm, mez, invis, your enchanter pet, haste, slow, levitate. You also get resists, and much more. I linked to the Alakazam complete list here of all of the spells because there's quite a few of them, and being a good enchanter is going to require you to know, all of those spells, what you'll cast on yourself during which situations, which are useful for your group, etc. And I'm going to go over some of that here, but there's a lot of esoteric spells that you would want to learn. So, as I talk about here, normally I would make multiple spell sets when doing this. when playing a class that has as many buffs and spells as this, because when you go to buff your group, you're going to need to load a buff spell set, and then usually, depending on what area you're in and what sort of spells you have and short duration buffs you have, I might recommend a group spell set specifically for rebuffing in groups. For example, in Classic, Kunark and Velius, your mana regen and haste both last like under 20 minutes, and that would be a pain in the ass to constantly rememorize all of those spells over and over and over each time you need to buff them. So having a middle ground between group and buff sometimes helps. And then, of course, your solo/charm spell set, which would be different depending on, how many people you're with, which would most likely be 0 or 1 or 2 during that time. And that will allow you to, obviously, charm and solo effectively. So, shielding. As always, intelligence casters do get a shielding, and yours is called the same as everybody else's. Greater shielding, minor shielding, arch shielding, and then as you can see here, Shield of the Arcane, Mystic Shield. Basically all of those, all of your self-shielding stacks with more or less every other HP buff and AC buff that you get, so make sure you use them. It'll give you extra survivability for a very minor mana cost. So Clarity, this is your mana regen line. In Lucklin, it changes name. They really stop calling it Clarity, and they start calling it Key, K-E-I, and that kind of just sticks forever. Even on live, people will still ask for Key or they will ask for Clarity, one of the two. They usually will not call it by the modern name. Some people do, of course, like eventually I think VOA is an acronym for the mana regen. I also think that's an acronym for the haste during this era. So when people ask for, they'll, like I said, Clarity, Crack, or Key is usually what they ask for. But they're all referencing the same thing. So runes. We talked about this a little bit before. This is one of your underappreciated lines for an enchanter, and it can increase your survivability significantly. Basically, when you cast a rune on yourself, it will absorb damage, and then it will expire after it's finished absorbing all of the damage that it's meant to absorb. As I said before, runes will have a reagent cost, which is why many don't use them, but if you're soloing or you're going to be taking some damage, runes can help a lot. On live, one of the best enchanters that I've ever played with stacked tons of runes on himself, and he was able to he actually tanked a raid boss during Call of the Forsaken. I'm pretty sure it was Bixie 2, the raid boss that he tanked by spamming his runes, and that also generated enough threat for him to keep threat of the raid boss. It was pretty impressive to see. I'm sure it costed him, like 10k plat in that era, but it was proof of concept, I guess you could say, that enchanters can actually do amazing things if you know how to play them properly. So Tash. This is something you're going to want to cast on every mob, and it's one of your main debuffs. And basically all it does is it makes the enemies more susceptible to magical attacks. On raids, you're going to cast Tash constantly on the bosses, because that's one of the required debuffs. Usually Tash goes first, and then Mallow lands second, and then everybody starts throwing all of their other debuffs and attacking. So yeah, that would be something I'd recommend keeping on your bars in groups, raids, and solo. Tash is just a good thing to throw on the enemies because it will make all of your other stuff land more easily. Slow, that usually is the second thing that is followed up after Tash. You Tash the mob to lower their resist, and then you slow them to decrease their attack speed and their overall damage. That's a gigantic amount of support to a group when you slow something. So haste, we already talked about this. Melee will bug you for that. Membler, Charm, and Mez. So those three spells kind of go together. Membler, what that does is if you have a monster that's like running at you, well, actually I think you have to kind of Mez them first. If you Mez them and then you Membler them, when Mez fades, they'll just walk back to wherever it was that they, came from, basically. Membler will clear all aggro from the target and basically just erase their threat list, is the best way to describe it, I guess. And it can be very, very useful depending on the situation you're in. Usually I'd say it's better to be used during like solo or smaller numbers situations. Usually groups, if they pull too many mobs, they'll just mez them, then kill them. There's no reason to Membler them. So it's one of those spells that I would probably only put on my bars if I was, soloing or in like a duo or trio sort of situation. Charm we talked about earlier, and Mez, of course, like we talked about earlier too. That's one of your greatest CCs, and it basically puts any mob that you cast it on to sleep temporarily. So in Prophecy of Ro, many classes are going to be getting an aura for their class. Yours is called Illusionist's Aura, and it's okay, I guess is how I would describe it. It's going to be replaced in future expansions. That's more or less all you need to know. Eventually, in the future, you're going to get a couple different auras, actually. One of the ones that a lot of enchanters use is during raids, primarily. It will add damage to each attack, that each magical spell that somebody casts. I'm pretty sure it adds damage to that. But you also get an aura called... trying to think of the name. It's an XP aura. I know that. It's like it basically increases the overall experience that your group gets as long as they're in the aura. It's a very minor amount of experience, but it can be useful, especially if you have a lot of grinding to do. So AAs. This is the next thing that I would like to go over, and for AAs, I'm actually going to tab into the game, and we're going to look through them here because in the game we get all of the juicy information. So looking at our first expansion, Shadow of Luckland, well, the first expansion that adds AAs, we get Dire Charm, Gather Mana, Mass Group Buff, and Spellcasting Subtlety. So Dire Charm we talked about a little bit, and as you can see, it limits you to 46 or lower mob, and it will permanently charm that creature. I believe that can go up a little bit, and then eventually they changed Dire Charm to not being a permanent charm and to just being like a charm that lasts like 5 minutes or 6 minutes, or, you know, I'm pretty sure you can increase the duration that the charm lasts. But Dire Charm is really only good during Luckland and Plains of Power, and then people stop using it, and then nobody uses it anymore in the future. So Gather Mana, this is a very important AA and very useful. In this era, it will basically restore all of your mana when you use it. As you can see, it has a 2 hour and 30-minute cooldown, which quite a bit of time, but you'll be able to use Gather Mana. There's two situations where I'd say it's most useful. Oh shit situations where you really need mana and, you know, you're going to die. I'm pretty sure it has a 10-second cast time. 2-second cast time. Okay, so it's not like the future spells. But it's a good burst of mana. Use it when you die and then get rezzed. Use it on raids, etc. There's definitely situations where it will be useful. Mass Group Buff. So this spell is one you'll be very acquainted with as an enchanter. It basically will turn any group buff into a AoE buff that hits everybody in the area. That's very good, especially when you want to buff a whole raid with haste or key or whatever it may be. And yeah. Get it, basically, and use it. It'll save you a lot of time buffing, especially if you plan to raid. Or if you just want to be a nice little enchanter that does, like, you know, group buffs in Nexus or Plane of Power or Plane of Knowledge. That's great, too. Spellcasting Subtlety. This reduces the hate you generate from your attacks. I'd say this is quite important for you in this era because slow causes a lot of hate, and usually threat kind of sucks in this era. So looking at Plains of Power, we have Eldritch Rune. So this is a little AA rune that you can use. I'd recommend you basically add this into your self-buffing macro. So whenever you go through and do all of your self-buffs on yourself, just cast this on yourself. And I think this can be casted on another player too. Nope, self only. Project Illusion. So this allows you to use one of your little self illusion spells on somebody else. It's neat, but it's not anything that, you know, is going to make or break your class. And this Companion Suspension sucks so bad you don't even want to get it. So Gates of Discord, Doppelganger. This is a kind of useless AA, if I'm being honest. On live, we kind of use this to like up our damage a little bit. It doesn't really do much else except for that. Like the Doppelganger is kind of designed for you to summon it and then for it to basically draw aggro off of the monster that you're fighting. And it works and all, but you're an enchanter and your Doppelganger doesn't really know how to play. So he's going to die within like 5 to 10 seconds after he pulls aggro. So that's usually why people tend to use it for damage instead of actually what it seems to be designed for, which is threat. Because as you see here, it says this doppelganger can cast any single target direct damage or stun spell you currently have memorized. So it will do damage when you summon him as a doppelganger. It's just, don't expect him to tank anything. He's as fragile as you are. So moving on to Omens of War after Gates of Discord. So Color Shock, this will basically anything that attacks you has a small chance of getting stunned in melee. It's decent. You'll definitely want to use it. There's no reason not to use it. So it definitely helps. Mind over Matter. Ouchies. Banged my elbow into the desk. So it absorbs 50% incoming damage with your mana rather than your health for up to 10 hits for 15 minutes. There are situations where it's okay to use and other situations where I wouldn't really recommend it. I mean, it's personally on live, we never use it. It's one of those things that we just put points into and discard, don't really care about. I can see some situations where it might be useful though, but just be careful. Your mana is almost as important as your health. So you can see this Noctambulate here. I'm pretty sure this is a mez that cannot fail. Yes, you can see it has a negative 1000 resist check, which means they're not resisting it. But the duration is only 6 seconds, as you can see. So it's a very short duration. Well, that's strange. It says 1 minute here, but it says duration 6 seconds here. So it's probably correct here where it says 1 minute, but it's a very short duration mez that cannot fail that has a very, very, very long cooldown, as you can see, 36 minutes. So, there's going to be situations where it's definitely useful and situations where it's definitely not. So looking at Dragons of Norath, nothing is added, and Depths of Dark Hollow are penultimate expansion. This adds silent casting. So, as you can see here, as it says, this ability, when activated, reduces the amount of hatred your spells generate. Eventually, this will get up to 100% threat reduction for your spells. I believe so, at least. And this spell becomes one of the spells that is vital in your burn rotation later on in the game. And I'd say that's true for basically all caster classes. Eventually, all caster classes will get silent casting, and later on in the game, they will be using this during all of their burns. Basically, you'll pop silent casting along with twin cast, along with, here, let me show you. In the future, you'll do silent casting along with twin cast, along with any of the other things that you have that are good. Focus of Arcanum, this too, that will reduce your spell resist or spells from getting resisted, and you're also going to get other things that buff your damage too, if I can find them. Illusions of Grandeur, this one. IOG, this eventually becomes your best ADPS spell. Chromatic Haze, this is something you're going to be popping during your burns as well. And that would all be part of future guides, as you can see, because as you can see, we're looking at Reign of Fear right now. So quite a ways until that gets added into the game. And that's why, like I said, that the classes are kind of consistent through this era. And then after this era, they start to change pretty dramatically. And they'll need a whole new guide for themselves in that future era. So looking at going back to our Enchanter guide, our next section and final section is how to play Enchanter Basics. So this is something, first I link to 2 other guides here. As you can see, these guides will go over Enchanters in Classic through Velius. One of them is to the Project 1999 wiki, and the other one is to a Google Doc guide. So obviously the Project 99 one will go up to Velius, and that's it. And they explain in detail charming and basically soloing on enchanters during those early eras. That's something I have basically no experience on. So I can't really give you accurate information on that, which is why I give you the guide so you can go, read those if that's your interest. What I have a lot of experience on as far as an enchanter is grouping with them, raiding with them, and boxing on them. That's where all of my experience comes from. So I know what spells to use on them as far as all of that goes, but I'm a lot less good at charming and all of that fun stuff. So, when you join a group on an enchanter, the first thing you're going to usually do is buff up the group. You're going to want to give them mana regen and haste. Haste is, more or less, you'll want to give them always both because there's always going to be both in the group. Eventually, during Lucklin, you will get group versions of both of them, which makes your life a lot easier. And until Lucklin, though, you're going to be casting it on each individual player, and that is going to be tedious and annoying, but can't really do anything about it in this era. The next thing you want to do is figure out if the map you're in is going to require you to mez and how much you're going to have to mez. This kind of is a subjective determination depending on the group that you're in. So some groups suck, some groups do not suck. Some groups are going to be able to pull 5 mobs and tank them all and basically kill them in no time, and other groups are going to need those 4 mobs of those 5 to be mezzed. So you're going to have to figure this out and learn what your role is and what that group needs you to do. You can also just ask, too, instead of, figuring it out. So usually what's going to happen is when a group pulls mobs, it'll come to the area, you'll mez any adds, and then you're going to start debuffing whatever mobs exist. So you want to cast Tash on the mob, and then you want to follow up with Slow, and then sometimes you'll use Cripple. If they pull multiple mobs, sometimes you'll want to pre-debuff mobs as you wait for them to be killed. So, for example, they pull 5 mobs, you mez 4. The first one will be dead by the time you're done with all of the mezzes, hopefully. One could hope. And then, if that happens, you'll just basically want to start slowing the mezzed mobs. That way, whenever mez breaks, the mob's already slowed, and it's already going to be doing a lot less damage. That is more or less your main purpose / role in the group. You'll only want to start doing direct damage, aka nuking mobs or doing dots or whatever else after you're done what your main job is. Unless the group tells you, don't worry about, mezzes, just give us haste, clarity, and blow shit up with your nukes. Some groups may very well tell you that. Like I said, it depends a lot on the zone that you come into and the group. Because there's going to be plenty of dungeons and zones where you don't really need to mez anything. One that comes to mind right now during Lucklin is Grieg's End. For the most part, you're basically always fighting 1 or 2 mobs at a time in that zone. There's rare situations where you'll get more, but they don't really hit that hard there. And it's not, the end of the world even if you do get more sometimes. Depends on your group, depends on your gear, and stuff like that. And then there's other places like LDONs where a lot of pulls will not require any mezzes. Some will. There's also going to be other zones where most pulls will require no mezzes, but there's an occasional messed up pull you get where it pulls 5 to 10, and that's going to require you to freak out and mez everything. There's a whole bunch of situations like that. So you'll always want to keep mez on your bars and be ready for the worst possible situation that can happen, because that is kind of what your role is. Your role is there to save the group from the worst possible situation that happens. And that is a good summary of what an enchanter does. And of course, assist, etc., etc. But that's more or less all you'll be doing during this era. And eventually, I think I have a little bit of information here about raiding. On raiding, as far as I'm aware, you're kind of like a buff bot. You'll occasionally charm mobs too, depending on where the raid is and what you guys are doing. But more often than not, you're really not expected to be a DPS class on raids. You're expected to buff the DPS and provide support to the raid as a whole. And that's really all there is to it. If you guys would like to learn more about the Enchanter class, I'd recommend you read over my guide and check out the links that I have here. I'm also going to add more tips and tricks down here in the future. As you can see, I just have a Google Doc that I slapped to there, which is this one right here. This guide on the Enchanter. So I'm going to add my research documents down here, and I'm also going to add more tips and tricks as they come to mind about this. And of course, I'm going to add the video to this page too, now that I'm done it. But that's really all there is to playing an Enchanter in Classic EQ. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, be sure to leave me a like because that helps me out. And aside from that, I will catch you guys around in future EverQuest class guide videos. Peace.